So this is Robert Brown, who's here with us tonight. So thank you for being here. We've got a lot of questions for you and like to hear your insight about this last election that we just saw.
Sure. Glad to be here. So just as a brief introduction, again, name's Robert Brown, and I'm a nationally known constitutional scholar, which gives me some interesting perspective as I've been able to travel the country and work with a lot of people all around the country on various constitutional issues and that type of thing. And so coming from that background, I feel like I have a little bit of insight to share with what I'm seeing in Utah, because what I'm seeing in Utah is very different, very unique compared to what we've seen in many other states around the country, especially when it comes to our elections.
Right, thank you. So we appreciate your expertise that you've been looking at these constitutional issues, and tell us what your experience is with the primary election and any information that you have from that.
Well, I certainly had some things that became a concern to me with our last primary election here in Utah. There was recently, actually shortly after the primary election, Utah County held a public meeting to show some of what was transpired in the election, largely as a way of helping gain some public trust and some transparency here. Here's the data, here's what we found, here's how the elections went, and so on. This was for the Utah County Board of Canvassers. And some of the charts and things that came out at that meeting were very surprising, might be a good way to put it. I was a little intrigued and wanted to look into it a little bit deeper, so I was able to get a copy of some of these publicly available charts of how the election went. There were a few races that really stood out to me. And so I'm going to show you some of the charts that they had there, and first we'll start with a kind of a normal race, something that looks very normal, very natural, nothing to see here type of a race.
Okay.
And with that one, it would be Ricky Hatch versus Tina Cannon.
Okay.
And so on this chart here, as you see, each of these little circles generally represent a batch of ballots, about 250 ballots. And if that batch, as you see here, that purple one right there, is right on the 50% line, that means 50% of that batch voted for Ricky Hatch, 50% of that batch voted for Tina Cannon.
Okay.
And so obviously the ones that are down lower, that 30%, meant about 70% went to Cannon, about 30% to Hatch.
Okay.
But one thing you'll notice is one batch is a little higher than the average. That center line is the average that it ended at, and some of them are below. But very quickly, it kind of is bouncing back and forth between and right around that average mark. You don't see a lot swinging way outside the lines and so on.
Right.
Until we get to Election Day, those roughly 3 weeks prior to Election Day, when there's mail-in ballots happening, there's drop box balloting happening, and so on, maintains pretty much the same. And then on Election Day, you'll notice there's a little bit of a shift to where that average line is. It dropped down from, it was 42% in the run-up before the election, and then it was 38% on Election Day for those who came in and voted in person.
Okay.
So nothing significant there. There's often a little bit of a shift on Election Day and so on. So that looks pretty normal. But where the other two races I want to highlight were so different, I felt like I want to get an expert opinion on this. And I happen to have two family members who are internationally known statisticians.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, very good at their field. They're very well known and have done a lot in that world. And so being that I'm not a statistician, I'm not exactly sure what all this means, sat down with both of them. And it was really interesting that, now on the one hand, one of them was very much, this looks really suspicious, and the other one was very guarded in how they said it.
Okay.
But you could still hear it in what they were saying, that their words were, this is a very strong trend. So I'm going to jump to the strong trend chart here. And this is the Spencer Cox versus Phil Lyman race. Right. And on this chart, anything above 50%, those batches were more in favor of Cox. Those below that 50% mark, obviously, more in favor, more of the ballots were voting for Lyman.
Okay.
And first of all, you notice right at the beginning of the election period there's a lot of dots that are way above that average dotted line in the middle, significantly above.
Right, I see that.
And those little heartbeat lines that you see going along, those represent what's called 3 standard deviations. Now, I had no idea what that means.
Right.
Lean on my family to teach me about what this means. What they said is, that's kind of the predictability of what should we be seeing based on the overall data typically 99.7% is what's considered, would stay within 3 standard deviations.
Okay.
So anything outside of that range is an anomaly somehow. Something is going on here, whether it means that the data is not legitimate, could be, or it could mean that there's some other influence causing it to be way outside the 3 standard deviations.
Okay.
Because almost all your data should be in there. And you notice here,
And that's those little heartbeat lines. Those are the
yeah,
deviations.
the heartbeat lines are the standard deviations. The reason they go up at certain points is when there's a lot smaller data set,
Okay.
like only a few ballots. If there were 10 ballots, for example, then your deviations could be huge because it's just very unpredictable.
I see.
But when you have a few thousand being recorded at the same time, then it's very predictable. And that's where most of the line is, right along there.
Okay, that makes sense.
So pretty interesting there.
Right.
And the first thing you notice here is this one, there's a lot of dots way outside of the standard deviations range,
Right.
which that alone is pretty interesting. What it's saying is hard to determine, but it's definitely saying something's happening here that's very different from most of the other races we're seeing in the primary election.
Right. Yeah.
There was only one other race that looked like this,
Okay.
and that was John Curtis. And his looked like a carbon copy. It was almost identical
Really.
to the Spencer Cox race here. But then the next really notable thing that they pointed out to me was on election day, it didn't just drop by 4%. It dropped by 32%. And they pointed out to me that that represents over 9 standard deviations. I don't even know what that means exactly, except that, okay, you're supposed to have 99.7% of the data should be within about 3 standard deviations. I don't know what 9 standard deviations means, except, and they couldn't really say either. Obviously, that doesn't mean X. It just means that this is really significant data.
Right.
This is telling a very strong story. And on the one hand, one of my family members was saying that clearly shows there's something fishy going on here, and the other one's a little more guarded. Until I shared with them, well, you know, one other bit of information you might find interesting was shortly after the election, the Attorney General sent out a message to county clerks.
The lieutenant general.
I'm sorry, the Attorney General. Yeah,
that's
misspoke
right.
there.
Yeah.
The Lieutenant Governor. Thank you for the correction. She sent out a message to the county clerks saying, do not release any of the election data, which is absurd. And of course, my family member that was a little more guarded on that, as soon as they heard that, were like, wow. Now, if I wasn't suspicious of this data up until now, I definitely would be based upon that information.
That's what the family member said.
Yes, that's what they'd said
Interesting.
regarding that, which I thought was quite interesting.
Right.
Now, putting in some of my background perspective to this as well, that as I've had the opportunity to testify before legislatures in many states around the country and really get to know the grassroots of who's on the ground there, a lot of the leaders and so on, but I've also had a lot of exposure to the election process in many states around the country. And most often what I see is things like cast vote records. After the election, you go on and they're there.
Right.
You don't even have to ask for them. It's just available, publicly available information. I've never seen a state that locks down our election data like Utah does.
Right. And it didn't used to be like that.
Right,
Things have just changed. We've seen a lot of it change the last few years, but some of this information, that used to be on the county website. And there's no reason why.
And of course, what I see in the other states, none of it's personally identifying. I wouldn't be able to go up and look up my neighbor there and see what they voted and so on, or even, you know, what they, if they voted even. But all of the general data that's non-personally identifiable is readily available. And we always spent time looking through on this race. It looks like you really held strong in these districts, and it was really weak in these districts and so on. It's all there. And it should be.
Right.
And to find that in Utah it was so locked down is a huge, huge red flag.
It is. It is a problem. And a lot of it, and even on some of these national races, we can see it how it's broken down more of timestamps when ballots come in. We don't have any of this that we can view. And this was a single county, right? That you were able to get access to?
This was Utah County. And the one thing I should mention is that the linear here is a timeline.
Okay.
So that this is basically the 3 weeks from left to right leading up to election day. And then at the very right, that drop is election day. Just to make sure that part's clear about it. Yeah. That information isn't even always available in Utah. In fact, from what I understand, Utah County was the only one that actually kept track of the timestamp. So you actually see the chronological
Are they the only ones
here.
that kept track, or the only ones who've let people have access
Kept
to
track
it?
even.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So even if we were to look into other counties, it would be harder to be able to produce this type of a a chart
Right.
to see the timeline regarding the election, which that tells us a lot, that there's this big swing from heavily in favor of Cox to heavily in favor of Lyman toward the end. And then on election day, massive shift where the average was 21% for Cox, 79% for Lyman. I mean, that's a massive shift.
And we expected to have more of our voters towards the end too, but it looks like this is just such an anomaly that this can't be explained through most natural reasons.
Right, and really the only way to get to the bottom of that story would be to have transparency, open up the data, and fully investigate. And this really does warrant a full investigation.
Right. And it's interesting because Phil Lyman, from the very start, he said that he would trust the election and he would, if he could verify it. And
concede and so on,
yeah, and we want to be able to verify the results of the election. So we've been asking for that the entire time. And not to be able to have this data is really damaging. It's really
for him to say, I'll concede if I can verify the election, then for them to shut it down and lock it down even more in response to that. Again, that says a lot.
Right.
But I saw in local media there was a poll run recently. I think it was KUTV News. That was how much do you trust our elections integrity, the security of our elections? And as I recall, there were 4 different levels that you really trust it, somewhat trust it, somewhat don't, or really don't.
Yes.
And what surprised me the most was around 70% were saying, I really don't trust our elections to be secure elections. That's a serious problem in Utah. Far more than really anywhere else in the country to have so many not trust the elections. And it really comes down to transparency. Transparency leads to trust. And so if, in fact, lately just on social media, almost every day I'm seeing ads from voteutah.gov trying to tell us how secure our elections are. And every time I'm just responding, if you want us to trust the elections, we need transparency. Why are all the election data in every county locked up?
Right.
That's what it comes down to. You want us to trust the elections, be trustworthy, show the data, let us see for ourselves. Because the lockdown is only breeding more and more distrust. Instead of spending thousands of dollars trying to tell us how safe it is, how secure it is, let's just do the actions that prove that it is. I think that's ultimately what needs to be happening right now.
That's right. Thank you. That's a great point. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.